Alright, we're back in contemporary difficulties. I talk about problems of corruption in the machine system. Actually, a lot of the cases these machines are just a group of people. Sometimes it's just one person. It's a political term they used was boss rule. Of course, a lot of corruption in these systems. What ended up happening is usually have one machine kicking another machine out of office. Once in a while, you might have enough grassroots anger, you might be able to elect someone independent of the machines to put a particular office, but it didn't happen very often. Actually, give an example here. 1872, one of the most notorious bosses ran one called Tammany Hall. This is the political machine in New York City. There's a Republican machine, but the Democrats basically ran New York City. The way politics in New York have run for decades and decades, basically the Democrats run the city, the Republicans basically run upstate. When in New York, the Democrat has to do really well in New York City, kind of break even upstate. The Republican has to basically run up the score upstate and break even in the city. And of course, the Tammany Hall people knew this. And basically, the ambitions of state politicians, all Democratic politicians all over the state, rested with them getting out the vote. And the guy in charge of this in 1872 was a man named William M. Tweed, Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed was taking bribes left and right. Like I said, he walked into his office, he'd be able to tell just by looking at you right off whether you're going to get a job or not. He'd write a note to somebody, sometimes like a red pen or something, say, get this man a job, and you'd get one. Blue pen be, if you have one maybe. But Tweed, he's a crook. Like I said, not only did he reward his allies with jobs, but a lot of companies who were supportive of Tweed and the machine, he made sure they got a lot of city contracts for various services. Of course, Tweed would get a little something for his troubles on the side. Open bribery. That day we'd call that campaign donation, but open bribery. Basically, this guy's selling jobs, selling city contracts. Because he ran the city, he'd get away with it. And so there are a lot of bosses like him in cities all over the United States at this point, but he's most notorious. In 1872, he's finally arrested for bribery and corruption charges and sent to jail. Like I say, the Tammany Hall machine became an issue in New York and national politics for years after that. Now, this whole time period, the post-Civil War era, is the most corrupt political period in American history. Like I said, we may today hear about, this guy's a crooked politician, he's a liar, whatever else. That's nothing to this time period, the Gilded Age. Basically, everything that wasn't nailed down was for sale. Everything that was nailed down was negotiable. Say Reconstruction, the governments in those 7 states, they were so corrupt. Not necessarily more corrupt than any others they deemed, but having to bear that level of corruption on top of the loss from the Civil War, while the Republicans were not back in office for over 100 years in the South. So you had corporations buying and selling politicians, cabinet members, basically openly bribing people, getting away with it. People are going to jail left and right over all these charges. Except the problem, disgusting a lot of people. It was basically the point that democracy was on the edge of breaking down in the United States. And say where the dollar becomes more important than the vote, it puts your system in danger, especially in a system based on the idea that all men are created equal. Now, the Republican Party was basically in power in the North after the 1870s. They started to split over the issue of reform several times. Now, they stayed in power not over lack of outrage over corruption, because they, what they said, waved the bloody shirt. Basically, the campaigns, they blamed the Democrats for the Civil War, basically telling the Northern Republicans, vote the way you shot. Which offended a lot of Democratic veterans, because they were saying they're fighting for the country, not for a political party. Of course, part of what put the Democrats back in power in the South was, remember, the Republican Party was not on the ballot until after the Civil War in the South. The Democrats did the same thing. They'd wave their own bloody shirt, telling Confederate veterans to vote the way they shot against Northern Republicans. So, in the late 1870s, you have two Republican groups vying for control of the party. It's called the Stalwarts. In favor of the machine system, in favor of the status quo. And the group called the Half-Breeds, in favor of reform. 1870 slang, I don't know why they were called this, but just know they were. Remember, one of the basic rules of history and society is, why do problems stay in place? Because there are a lot of people who have a vested interest in keeping the system the way it is. Stalwarts have that vested interest. A lot of them got their positions through the machine system. It worked for them. So they defended it. The Half-Breeds saw the corruption and said it's time to get rid of it. It's time to do better. Actually, so much so you have these two factions nominating different candidates for president on some occasions. The motto of the day was, to the victor go the spoils. And presidents were routinely badgered by their fellow partisans for lucrative federal appointments, and basically you have lines of people outside the White House asking for such thing, everything from cabinet appointments, ambassadorships, to being postmaster general of some tiny little town out in the middle of nowhere. Federal job, presidential appointment, meant good money. So get to the election of 1880. Okay, a very impressive ticket here. You have James A. Garfield, out for the Republicans, and reform is a huge issue here. You have Winfield Scott Hancock, for the Democrats. And for a third party candidate, you have a man named James B. Weaver. Party called the Greenback Party. Yeah, Winfield Scott Hancock. Weaver and the Greenback Party, basically that's a party oriented towards farmers. They're being squeezed in the economy of the 1870s and 1880s, and basically through a massive deflation, they're calling for massive inflation to inflate the commodities prices.
Hey, what was Hancock?
Hancock, Democrat. And actually enough about all three of these men, they'd all been generals in the Union Army during the Civil War. Very distinguished men in their own right. Hancock, for the Democrats, the perfect candidate, who was able to counteract the Republican bloody shirts. Well, it's a close, bitterly fought election. Garfield ends up with 48.5% of the vote, 214 electoral votes. Hancock gets 48.1%, 155 electoral votes. And the rest goes to Weaver, 3.4%. So Garfield wins. And reforms are huge. Corruption were huge issues. And a lot of accusations, a lot of voter fraud on both sides. How much there was, to what extent, we really don't know. But it's easy to step out losses those days. Remember, the place where elections are stolen historically is always in the counting process. And so you're not going to magically produce hundreds of people to show up and vote that don't exist or voting illegally. It's easier to manipulate the vote in the counting process. So Garfield's elected. So had a very good reputation, clean politician. Like I say, he's from Ohio. He'd been a teacher. Very intelligent man. It was said that he could had this trick where he could write in Latin with his left hand and would Greek with his right hand at the same time. Two different languages at the same time. So a parlor trick. He said it could be done. It just takes a lot of concentration. Huh? Yeah, Garfield could do that. It takes a lot of concentration to be done. So, remember, that is to the victor go the spoils. Except Garfield, impressive man. He had a reasonably good start, but was he going to make any kind of progress against the corruption that's so plaguing the nation? It's anybody's guess. You got to remember, when you elect a president, you're not electing a dictator for 4 years. You're electing basically the guy who's head of the executive branch. The question is, how well can he work with the legislative branch to get legislation through? So, it really just kind of depends on who's making up Congress. Is it an opposition party? Is it your own party? Who knows? Well, Garfield's inaugurated on March 4th, 1881. And in July 2nd, barely 4 months into his presidency, he's at a train station in Washington, D.C. He's about to go on vacation. On the train platform, about to board. But suddenly, a disgruntled office seeker named Charles Guiteau ran up to him, shot him, and mortally wounded him. For 2 months, Garfield suffered from his wound. But incompetent medical care has been making the problem worse. So 2 months, he probably could have lived with that bullet inside of him, but doctors kept probing for it, digging in, trying to dig out the bullet. Now, Stan, 1881, you don't have antibiotics. You have very primitive surgical techniques. You don't have x-rays. So they're basically just kind of feeling around inside of the guy, making the situation even worse. So, massive infection sets in. And yeah, September 19th, he died. At that point, as Vice President, Chester A. Arthur became president. Arthur hadn't held any elected office before then. Basically, got the job as Vice President basically because of people he knew at the convention. Works his way onto the ticket. Now, by this point, the spoil system cost the nation's president. Immediately calls went out to reform the government job system. This led to the creation of the Pendleton Act in 1883. It established a federal bipartisan civil service commission that administered competitive examinations and appointed office holders on the basis of merit. You get the job because you can do the job, that you're competent, not because of who you know. Like I say, a huge step forward. So you're Democrats and Republicans on the Civil Service Commission. Now, by competitive exams, basically, they give people tests on different aspects of their job. So legal details, technical details, and basically whoever got the highest scores in the exams, they would be getting the job or the promotion. That system all over the country, even here in El Dorado, you'll see ads in the paper talking about they're going to administer a civil service exam for police officers to get a promotion, or for firefighters to get a promotion. Now, initially, though, it only affects 14,000 out of the 100,000 employees working for the federal government. It doesn't affect everyone yet, but it's an important step in the right direction. It sets the precedent for a lot of later reforms and expansions of the civil service commissions. And, of course, how do people get into office? Now, with the 1880s and 1890s, in the South, politically is often referred to as the Solid South. That is, the region remained overwhelmingly Democratic up through the 1960s. Basically, every time there's a presidential election, you can guarantee every state in the old Confederacy is going to be voting for the Democratic candidates. But you have the occasional Republican who win, and have holdovers from Reconstruction remaining in office until about 1900. Basically, what ended up happening was, while African American men had the right to vote, guaranteed during Reconstruction, the old planter class started coming back into power and basically trying to turn the clock back to 1860, just before the Civil War. Do whatever they could, basically, to undo the Civil War, to basically reinstitute slavery in entirely different forms. Couldn't say slavery outright, but they could do everything they could to treat African Americans and other minorities like second-class citizens. Now, what they started doing was doing a policy of what could be called disfranchisement. So remember, where's the word franchise, which means to vote. To enfranchise means to give the vote. Disfranchise means to take it away. But these measures are gradually introduced to restrict the voting strength of blacks and poor whites, basically restricting the voting power of the lower classes in favor of the ruling classes in the South. So basically what's happening is men with all the wealth, all the money, all the land before the Civil War, they come back in after the Civil War, come back into power, a new generation of them, and start doing whatever it takes basically to solidify their hold on their state governments once again. So because the region always voted Democratic for president in almost every other office, power became concentrated in one party. Political interest groups flocked to the Democratic Party to be heard, so and having a lot of factions in these parties. In fact, there are a lot of cases of Republicans who were wanting to win elected office, so they had to run on the Democratic ticket because there's no way they could win as a Republican. In many cases, the Republicans wouldn't even offer a candidate for many offices. Governor, Congress, usually unopposed. So he wants to step up just to lose. Many state legislatures for decades didn't have any Republicans in either house of their state legislature. So you have these different groups, these different interests, basically trying to seize control of the Democratic Party in the different states. So 1911, Oscar B. Colquitt, who's the future governor of Texas, once said about the Democratic Party in Texas, Quote, Texas is a one-party state. We have enough debates for a half dozen. Arkansas, Louisiana, the rest of the old Confederacy have pretty much the same situation. You have Republicans and populists by the 1900s, numerous other groups existing small numbers, but they rarely bother to challenge many offices. They might have some success at the local level, usually not much, hardly ever at the state level. Something very unusual would have to happen for that to come about. Now, the minor opposition parties still voted, but they're extremely weak and were rarely able to make an impact except at the local level. Democrats managed to co-opt the major issues of these parties to keep their strength intact. Populists noticed about falling commodities prices. The Democrats said, well, we agree, but we can do that too, but here's what else we're going to do. You have these single-issue interest groups that are running. But people very rarely vote on just one issue. Like I said, the major parties say, oh yes, we agree with that, but we'll do this too. Basically, keeps them in power because, remember, majority rule. We need 50% of the vote plus one to win. Yes, now the Democratic Party, though, in the South in this time period is hardly monolithic. You see any and every stand on the major issues of the day. The conservatives and agrarian reformers both vying for control of the party. And the aristocrats, the upper classes, tried to maintain control through fraud, threatening subordinates to their jobs, and attempting to prohibit whole classes of the population from voting. Segments of the population which would oppose them at the polls. And they use a lot of race baiting too. Lower class blacks and lower class whites, economically, have the exact same interests. Except they usually both tenant farmers that is renting their land, basically deeply in debt, very poor. They could use a lot of reform measures to help out their situation, but the aristocrats be stirring up racial antagonisms to keep whites and blacks from unifying at the polls. Therefore, the upper class whites stayed in power. Essentially, most people vote their pocketbook, but a lot of people vote on the interest of can they have somebody to look down on. Now, ballot fraud is common in this period. Republicans and Democrats alike practiced it during Reconstruction. Practice still exists in some areas. Actually, about 15 years ago, I was in Texas. And there's this county where they had a primary, and some of the results just didn't quite add up right. So they went down for the voter roll list. You basically had to sign your name to get a ballot to show you showed up and voted. Well, a bunch of these names end up on this on these voter rolls, these different precincts, in the Republican primary. All these people came back later and said they didn't vote in that election. They were out of town that day, or they just didn't show up to vote. Somehow, magically, they ended up voting anyway. Basically, the balloting was rigged in the counting process. Like I said, there was a 1872, the Arkansas governor's election. There were so many ballots being stuffed left and right that we still don't know who the winner is. One candidate would have like 300 votes in a county, the opponent has 6. Go to the next county over, that first candidate had like 9 votes, the other one had 300. Basically, completely impossible totals. No rhyme or reason why any of those totals would be that way, but somehow it kept showing up turn after turn. Hundreds of ballots suddenly being discovered, others being thrown out for different reasons. Basically, the counting process completely manipulated, completely corrupted. Now, remember, fraud is practiced by those who control the ballot counting process, the ruling faction. Now, an infamous example of the extent of ballot fraud during this period is the 1888 Louisiana governor's election. Now, in the 1880s, African Americans still tended to vote very heavily Republican because they identify the Republican Party as the party of Lincoln, emancipation, and civil rights. Now, this view began to change in large amounts until the 1920s as the Republican support for civil rights started falling off. But the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt's commitment to including African Americans in New Deal relief programs solidified African American support for the Democratic Party. But at this point, 1888, they're still overwhelmingly Republican. And here's what you got here. Now, the Louisiana Republican slate included an African-American candidate for Secretary of State, James F. Patty. Now, election returns in several parishes in Louisiana had overwhelming African-American majorities, however, didn't show strong returns for the Republicans, but showed instead near unanimous support for the Democratic ticket. Concordia Parish, so looking at the population rolls of who all was eligible to vote, who did vote, voted not just 100% Democratic, but 115% Democratic. Kansas Parish, 112%. Madison Parish, 104%. Bossier Parish, 98%. Basically impossible voting totals, but yet that's what the numbers are showing. Louisiana voter rolls were stuffed with the names of dead men, people who moved and re-registered in other parishes, but still somehow managed to vote faithfully in their old parish each and every election. Now, see, the voter registration laws in Louisiana never specified removing names from the voter rolls. Basically, your name's on there, your name's permanent, and somehow somebody made sure you voted. Giving some more numbers here. Voter registration in Louisiana. Percentage of white men. Percentage of black men. They're men only because women don't have the right to vote in Louisiana yet. On January 1st, 1896, Louisiana voter rolls show that a very impressive 96.3% of white men were registered to vote. And 93% of African American men are registered to vote. The next year, January 1st, 1897, voter registration tops out at an all-time record high of 103.2%. So you don't have to have mastered algebra to figure out there's something wrong there. American men, 95.6%. So basically, democracy is becoming a joke in Louisiana. The Louisiana legislature realized they had to do something to clean this all up. So they passed a whole series of laws in the 1897 session, which created, among other things, basically a new voter registration law, basically wiped out all the rolls and made everybody re-register to vote. Everyone eligible had to sign up again. A secret ballot was created, also called the Australian ballot. But what ended up happening was, because of the new registration law, you had to prove you could read and write. Which meant the illiterates couldn't vote. The only people who could afford an education or get an education this time period were middle and upper class whites. So you have a few African Americans in the business community in New Orleans, but you can meet the qualifications. But because of the numbers were so small, like I said, the planter class could accept that. Remember, most African Americans in Louisiana, at this point, they'd grown up in, a lot of them had grown up in slavery. It was illegal to teach them to read or write. Some might have had some education in a freedmen's school during the Reconstruction, but not very many. So it meant the overwhelming majority of African Americans could not read or write. And the lower class whites, same situation. Those two were the biggest threats to the planter class in Louisiana. Basically, stripped away from the voter rolls. Remember, the 14th and even the 15th Amendment guaranteed civil rights. The 15th Amendment said African American men have the right to vote. Now, states like Louisiana, who basically wanted to get rid of African American voters, they simply just couldn't pass a law saying whites only can only vote. They had to find something in common that African Americans had other than skin color to keep them from voting. What they found was shockingly deep poverty and illiteracy. So the new voter registration rules coming out in 1898. So the white men registered to vote, 46.6%. Percentage of African American men, 9.5%. Basically, African American voting strength was decimated in Louisiana. Now, in the North, the economy is based on industry compared to the South's emphasis on agriculture. Industrialists in the North use the ballot to maintain ballot control. Now, with an open ballot, everybody can see who voted for who. Basically, you go in, you sign your name, or your name's put on your ballot, it's put in the ballot box, and then you can go back later and see who did you vote for. And guys who ran these factories could go back through after the election, see who voted for who, and fire people on the basis of who they voted for. Vote for the wrong person, you're out of a job. And it was entirely legal. So, with the secret ballot, which the reformers and labor leaders pushed for, in the North it meant people can't be fired for voting for the wrong person. Factory workers can't be fired. But turn around the South. In the South, a printed ballot, a secret ballot meant, if you're illiterate, meant you can't vote because you can't read the ballot. It meant that actually you couldn't have somebody help you out. Today you can. In Arkansas, it is the law that you can request assistance with your if you need help voting. By this time, you couldn't. You might have a friend helping you out, telling you who's on what to vote for, but with the new voter registration laws, the secret ballot laws in Louisiana, you couldn't. Now, in the South, you could threaten people with their jobs. If you have farmers, well, they own their own land. A lot of them do. But suppose those who don't own their own land. Migrant farm workers, actually tell them they vote for the wrong person, they're fired, what are they going to do? Just go up the road to the next farm. Sharecroppers, like I said, for the landowners, the people renting the lands, That's people making the money for it. They're not going to kick them off the land because they voted for the wrong person. Basically, they're just trying to do what they can to keep them from voting at all. Now, between 1889 and 1904, 7 of the 11 former Confederate states enacted secret ballots. Other measures included a literacy test, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses that ensure that whites would not be disfranchised through these measures. Get a couple handout here. Show you who did what. Look at some of these different measures they put in place, like, for example, the poll tax. So most southern states put in some version of the poll tax at some time or another. Basically, all 11 Confederate states had enacted the poll tax one way or another. Basically, it meant you had to pay $1 to register to vote. Like I said, $1 may not seem like much in today's age, but this time period, in the 1870s, 1880s, and 90s, early 20th century, that $1 made the difference whether or not you ate that night. It was simply too high a price to pay for democracy. And a lot of people were opposed to it, but what ended up happening in a lot of states, like Arkansas and Texas, was they took all that poll tax money and put it into schools. So basically, if you tax the poll tax, you're taxing financing for education. Registration laws here, like Louisiana, basically clearing the voter rolls, telling people when they can register and so forth. A lot of these laws basically made it just as difficult as possible to register to vote. Basically, you had to go to the county courthouse on a particular day of the year to go register. It's very difficult to some people in outlying areas. 3 states, South Carolina, Florida, North Carolina, passed what's called the multiple box laws. Basically, they have separate boxes for every separate ballots for major races. For example, I'd have a box for federal races, box for state races, another one for state legislature, another for county and local races. And basically, you had to put your ballots all in the right order, put them all in the correct boxes, otherwise it wouldn't vote. And they switched the box order around, so it meant the guy who was helping his literate friend out with the voting, like I said, couldn't help him get the ballots in the right order. So about, like we discussed, the literacy tests in 7 states. Basically, have to prove that you could read and write. Some states, a lot of these states went further, what's called an understanding clause. So basically, you had to prove you understood what you wrote or read. Some states, I think it was Alabama. Basically, you had to be able to recite a clause of the state constitution to be able to register to vote. There's this one story. This man, African American gentleman, who was registering to vote in Alabama, is a college graduate. A lot more education than the county clerk, and passes the literacy test, and says, county clerk says, "Do you understand what that means?" That's what it says, "Yep." And I think it means I can't vote. Because with these literacy tests and everything, administered at the county level, even if you passed, you didn't pass. And of course, the grandfather clause. Now, that these states don't want to get rid of, make it difficult for whites to vote. What they do is they simply say, if you or an ancestor was eligible to vote in 1860, you don't have to take the literacy test. Who's eligible to vote in 1860? for the Civil War.
White people.
Whites. It's basically whites could keep voting even they were illiterate. It took many, many years to finally undo these laws. Actually, some states passed them quite a bit all at once. For example, here in Arkansas, 1891, 1892, you only had 2 separate restriction measures passed. The secret ballot passed in 1891 and the poll tax in 1892. For Arkansas, that was all that's needed. They were just simply too poor. For example, in 1891, Arkansas had 11 African-American state representatives and 1 African-American state senator. After the poll tax, the secret ballot went into effect, all 12 were swept from office. The next African-American to hold a position in the state legislature wasn't until 1972. And there are all sorts of ways around this. Simply, there's a story of this sheriff's race in Louisiana. This guy goes to this one African-American neighborhood and gives the block captains 100 right shoes. Right shoes, not right inlet pair of shoes, just the right shoe. And the guy tells him, said, unless I get 100 votes out of this precinct, then you'll get the 100 left shoes. But only then. Now guess what? They got 100 votes out of that precinct. Well, the poll tax is not eliminated until the 24th Amendment is ratified in 1964. Finally banning the poll tax everywhere. And all these other measures here, they're kept on the law books in these southern states until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is passed, getting rid of all these restrictions. Basically, the right to vote is that. It's a right. It's not a privilege. It's not something you have to beg for, pay for. It is basically, because you were an American citizen over 21 after 1971, after 18, you can show up and vote free of cost, just like everybody else in your state and across the country. Of course, this is just one example of what can be called Jim Crow laws. Where the term Jim Crow comes from, a lot of different disputes over it, but basically it was synonymous with enforcing a system of white supremacy. Essentially, Jim Crow laws, they're a series of laws designed to enforce white supremacy. Basically creating a racial caste system. Where whites are on top, everybody else is on bottom. It's finding whatever way you can to strip whites away from minorities, humiliate them in whatever means possible. Included laws restricting voting, segregated schools and segregated public places, all sorts of things. Some communities had laws saying that whites and African Americans could not walk on the same sidewalk at the same time. I say you start seeing it emerging in the 1860s after the Civil War, but it accelerates in the 1890s. Now, a series of Supreme Court decisions in the 1880s upheld that civil rights legislation passed during Reconstruction in the 1860s and 70s did lawfully prevent discrimination in government activities. But it's read so narrowly as to say that this legislation did not prohibit discrimination by private businesses. This law segregating hotels, restaurants, and other places were enacted across the South and in many areas of the North. So what it meant was private businesses were not bound by these discrimination laws, but states started passing laws to make sure that they did discriminate. I'll start with this case right here, Leslie versus Ferguson. And last, we're out of time.